So we're going to shift now from muscles, okay, to a concept that is going to be related to force production. It's going to play a key role in letting us generate force, especially letting us generate force repeatedly so that we can walk and run and bike and exist in some ways, right? So remember, what we're going to do is we need ATP to break cross bridges. Okay? Remember this. This is the key point. Okay? This is the key point. When you do any kind of muscle action, especially if it's concentric, you're breaking thousands and thousands and thousands of cross bridges during a single contraction. So when you do multiple contractions consecutively, you are breaking millions upon millions of cross bridges, and so that costs us energy. Okay? We also need energy to run Circa. Who remembers what Circa is? Calcium ATP. We need to suck the calcium back into the ESR so that we can do that. We also need ATP to run, we didn't talk about it really at all, the sodium and potassium pump. Okay? We use the sodium potassium pump to repolarize excitable membranes when actually sarcolemma, so along the axons, in the cell bodies, in the dendrites, those places. So these are the primary places as it relates to exercise, okay, where we are going to use ATP. All of you right now, while you sit there, are screaming towards death at an alarming rate, consuming oxygen and replenishing your ATP stores, okay? So that's what's going on. You have some amount of energy expenditure as it's used as ATP. Good. Wow. We use a certain amount of ATP for your energy expenditure at rest. One, you're sitting there, you're doing some mild muscle contractions from the posture. You're breathing, your diaphragm needs energy. Your heart is beating, your cardiac muscle needs energy, okay? The brain uses some energy just to sit there and be alive, okay? It uses less so when I drone on for a while and you kind of zone out and kind of fall asleep. In exercise, here's where this is coming from. Please remember this. We need to refer ourselves back to this all the time, okay? With metabolism, specifically with muscle metabolism, okay? We're not talking about what happens in the brain. We're not really talking about what happens in cardiac muscle or anything else. With metabolism in muscles, what we are trying to do is take our very small quantity of ATP and just turn it over and over and over again, okay? So that you can continue to have ATP to do these kinds of things. And we'll walk our way through how that's going to go. I'm going to break the lecture down, okay? I know on the syllabus it talks about doing it from a substrate standpoint, talking about proteins and carbohydrates and lipids. What we're really going to do, I think, is we're going to break it down from a pathway standpoint, okay? And we'll talk about the individual substrates that can be moved through each pathway. And then we'll really kind of single out fat on the back end, okay? We'll talk about the pathways, we'll talk about the control points in all of these contractions and kind of how all of them work together to arrive at some amount of ATP that we need to make energy expenditure. That may be you here at rest. It might be if you go for a walk. It might be if you go for a jog, and then it might change if you're going to jog for a half an hour versus 5 minutes or something. Okay? So today we're going to go through just some of the general pathways. Let's talk about these things. My guess is that you guys have seen the majority of these things before. Okay? We'll talk about a few of the very key control points. I'm not going to make you memorize every step in the pathway. Okay? If you were our undergrad and you had Dr. Mike, you've already got this, you've already done it. Okay? If you've had biochemistry, you had to memorize the pathway, the substrates, They're actual, right, structures, all of the enzymes and those kinds of things. We're not going to do that. You have a textbook, you can look that shit up. Okay? We're going to focus more so on what goes in and what comes out of each pathway. Where are the key places that those pathways, that the speed of those pathways are going to be regulated? Okay? And how one interacts with the other. Because that's what I want us to get, is if I'm going to start walking, certain things happen. Okay? If I go from walking to running, certain things happen. If I go and I increase my time on things, certain things are going to happen. All of which are very predictable based upon how the pathway functions, which ones are fast, which ones are slow. If I feed you certain things, that affects which pathway gets used, et cetera, et cetera. We'll go through more of that stuff then. Okay, third step in glycolysis is we go from, right? We go from glucose 6-phosphate to glucose 1,6-phosphate, and that's run by this particular enzyme. Then we're going to split it, right? And we're going to go from glucose into 3-carbon molecule. Dr. Black can't remember right now. And eventually we get down and we get pyruvate. So we'll kind of move our way through a little bit that way. Okay. Okay. So metabolism itself is deriving chemical energy from the breakdown of various substrates. So the thing that goes into the pathway we call a substrate. Okay. Whatever foods you eat is mostly a substrate. But that's going to be, is it a carbohydrate, right? Is it glucose? Is it fructose? Is it galactose? Is it sucrose? Something like that. Is it a carbohydrate? Is it a lipid? Okay. Lipids come in all sorts of sizes and shapes and flavors, if you will. Is it carbohydrate? Right? Is it a free fatty acid? How many carbons does it have? We'll get into that a little bit later on, but the process is roughly similar. Okay. So foodstuffs or stored energy. We'll talk about where we store things. Okay. We talked about why it's important. Let's talk about its significance to exercise. Okay. Muscles drive everything. Okay. They generate the force, but they need energy in order to generate that force. So when we want to tone ourselves up, we need to exercise in a certain way or not eat as much in a certain way. But physiological responses that occur to an acute bout of exercise. Okay. If we ask, I don't know, Ethan to stand up and do jumping jacks, I can acutely change and alter his metabolism right now by having it. The fact that I even mentioned it to him, he's changed his, I've invoked the metabolic response and other physiological responses. Response to the metabolic response. Okay. So changes in breathing and respiration, hormone levels, okay, heart rate, cardiovascular changes. The vast majority of them are going to be driven by and take root by the change in metabolism. Okay? I need to get more substrates to muscles because I've got higher ATP turnover. I need to get more oxygen or something to those muscles. I need to bring certain hormones to those muscles. Okay? So a lot of the physiological response is driven by the change in metabolism. Many of the training adaptations that we will see, okay, are likely going to be driven by the acute change in metabolism that we see as well. They're related to or they're proportional to energy expended. Okay? You may not think in some ways that I'm going to do squats, I'm going to do heavy squats until I can't do them anymore. And you may not think that that's really limiting it from a metabolic standpoint because it's not a high energy cost. But when you work to task failure, when you work to fatigue, you run through a bunch of ATP and you really change the homeostatic environment in the muscle. You really change how metabolism for a very brief period of time is working. And so a lot of our training adaptations are going to occur in order to prevent the disruption of metabolic homeostasis. Because if we disrupt metabolic homeostasis, you're probably going to die. Okay? All right. Performance is very often limited by the rate that energy can be made available, especially during sprints and especially during very long endurance events. Okay? Very long endurance events. So metabolism can be a limiting factor in exercise performance. And so in a lot of other ways, then fatigue, or your sort of lack of ability to generate an adequate amount of force, which controls running speed or how many times you can lift the weight or how many push-ups you can do, whatever that is, can be caused by decreased availability of energy or an accumulation of certain metabolic byproducts that limit your ability to continue to make energy. Okay? So there's a lot that goes on. The muscles are where the force is produced. The muscles use the ATP, but the rate at which that is used, the amount at which that is used, the time over which that is used, is then going to evoke changes in these metabolic pathways, which evoke changes in other sort of systems that we will talk about later on in class. And all of that works together to drive our adaptations. Okay? So again, like so many things, physiology is integrated. Performance with exercise is integrated, okay? Many of you look very sleepy, and we're about to integrate some increase in metabolism into class. And we'll just stand and do half squats until people look a little less tired, okay? All right, so energy is in some ways defined as the ability to perform work, okay? Bioenergetics can be defined as the flow or the exchange of energy within a living system. We've got the first law of thermodynamics, right? The energy cannot be created or destroyed, but is transferred from one form to another without being depleted, right? And you can talk about it as total energy in a system as the potential energy plus the kinetic energy. What I really want you to take from the first law of thermodynamics is that when we talk about generating ATP in metabolism, what we're really doing is not making fresh ATP. What we're doing is using the adenosine and the sort of as the scaffolding that we have a certain amount of in our cells, and we're just going to keep tacking phosphate groups on. They get pulled off in the muscle. We have ADP, and then we put a phosphate back on. We just recycle basically all of this. And so we're just kind of going around in a circle. And so when we are unable to supply an adequate amount of energy, what that means is just that we're unable to match the rate of resynthesis of ATP with energy demand from muscles and the sodium potassium pump and calcium ATPase. Does that idea make sense? That's a really, really key idea. If we don't get that, then like everything else that we're going to talk about, it's going to be pretty good. Okay. Okay. All right. So I'm not really going to worry about these. Let's talk about ATP for just a second. Okay. So ATP is the energy that's going to be available to us in our cells. If we wanted to, we can break sort of per ATP. You can break that down into something that most people understand, which is a kilocalorie. Or a calorie. You look on the back of a package of food, it says there's 100 calories in this or whatever. What they really mean is there's 100 kcals. And so that can equate to the ability of whatever that thing was that you just ate to be broken down, and it can produce, right? It can produce a certain amount of ATP. The rate of use of ATP in exercise depends upon the force production. Depends upon the rate of work being done, okay? So if I'm marching in place like this, I use a certain amount of ATP. A little faster, I use more, right? More force to go faster, more force to put my legs up higher, all right? That requires more ATP. So that is what we would call exercise intensity. The intensity domain of exercise is really just what is the energy expenditure, what's the ATP cost of that rate of work. Okay? The use of ATP varies with fiber types. The big thing, though, is that our total amount of energy stored as ATP within a cell is very, 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 very low. You don't have a lot of ATP in your cells. There's just not room for it. Okay? You've got actin and myosin and all the other stuff. There's just not that much room to cram it full of ATP. And so you've got this sort of maybe 80 to 100 grams in a cell. And all that you're going to do is you're going to convert some of this into ADP as we need it, and then you're going to just replenish it. So it just keeps getting in this cycle. it keeps getting broken down and used, and then it gets replenished. Broken down and then replenished. Okay? So if we want to replenish ATP, we're going to use several pathways and several energy substrates. The pathway that we're going to use and substrate that we'll use is going to vary based upon what's the mode of exercise, especially what is the intensity of exercise. How much oxygen is available, okay? What is your state of training? So especially aerobic training, like how many mitochondria do you have, or fiber type looking like, that's going to play some role. And then your antecedent diet, what you've been eating of late, is also going to play some role in pathway and substrate. We can use carbohydrates, so glucose, which is often stored in your body as glycogen in the liver and the muscle. I do want you all to know these two things. Okay, we store glucose in the liver and muscle. These glycogen stores are going to be used at different times for different reasons. We'll talk more about that probably on Wednesday. Okay. We can use lipid, which can be sort of broken down from adipose tissue, subcutaneous adipose tissue. It can be adipose tissue in the liver. There is some adipose tissue or some stored fat that is often in the muscle itself, called intramyocellular lipid. Some really interesting stuff to do with all of that. Or you may have free fatty acids or cholesterol and things that are going to be floating around in the bloodstream. Okay. We have a significantly larger capacity because most of us are not as lean as our cadaver to store energy as fat rather than carbohydrates. Okay? We have a lot more adipose tissue than we do glycogen. So those two things are going to come into play into which one of these are going to use during long bouts of exercise, which one of these to use if you're in a state of starvation, and then kind of how we replenish these things is also going to play a role, which is beyond the scope of our class, but we'll like to have you there. If push comes to shove, and that's all that you give your body is protein, you're a low carb, high protein, high fat person, or if you're a person that is in a relatively severe caloric deficit where you're not eating really anything, okay, then we can break protein from the muscles or other places down, or protein from your diet, break it down into amino acids, convert it in the liver through a process called gluconeogenesis. Or we can, in some instances, directly use protein. We can make energy out of this. Okay? And so, if you look at it that way, we have a significant amount of energy stored as protein in our body. We've got muscle, but there's much more of a consequence of breaking this down if you break down our okay? Typically, you only will break down protein when you're in negative caloric balance. This is what I mean by you'll use internal or stored protein, like muscle, will get broken down if you're in a negative caloric balance. If you only feed yourself, you just eat steak all the time, right? Or you just eat chicken all the time, then you will use some of that protein. You'll make energy out of that protein. Either because you're just not supplying it. You're reasonably good at that. Okay. Bunch of words that all sound roughly the same, but that mean slightly different things that I want you all to know. Glycolysis, okay? The kind of glyco is going to talk about things that we are doing with carbohydrates, things we're doing with glucose, okay? Glycolysis is the pathway or the process by which we break down glucose into ATP, and we're going to take it all the way to lactate or lactic acid. I'll get into all the steps in 2 minutes. Glycogenesis is just what it means, right? We're making glycogen, we're generating glycogen from multiple glucose molecules. So glycolysis is breaking glucose down. Glycogenesis is making glycogen from glucose. The opposite of glycogenesis is something called glycogenolysis, right? Which is the breakdown of glycogen into its constituent glucose molecules. This is a key reaction that is going to become really important for exercise. It's driven by an enzyme called phosphorylase. phosphorylase. So when you activate a phosphorylase, it's going to tell your muscles or your liver to begin to break down. And then gluconeogenesis is the process of making glucose from non-glucose substrates. This typically happens in the liver, and it is especially going to be prominent in these amino acids from protein. Okay. So, especially if you eat a lot of protein, you're going to get a substantial amount of glucose that's going to get dumped into your blood, and they potentially get stored as glycogen somewhere from this gluconeogenesis. Okay, this is just some math. The 150-pound person or 183-pound person with 12% body fat. Probably would be considered a very lean, like small guy. Okay, 12% body fat. I guess so if a woman has 12% body fat, she's almost amenorrheic. And so that's probably not, this is probably a little small on that side. But you'll just know, look, here's the stored carbohydrates, about 1,500 kcals, and then fat in a person that doesn't have very much fat, they're at about 70,000. Okay. So you can imagine in a regular person like me, I probably have a little bit more stored because I've got more muscle in this person, a little bit more than this 1,500, but I probably have a lot more than this. This just illustrates, right? Like you've got adipose tissue stores of ATP for days, okay, weeks in some instances. Like you can live if you get water for several weeks without food. It won't be very pleasant, but you can do it. You won't just die. And it's because you've got all of this. So if you imagine, right, that if we really just had you lay there and not do anything, if your resting metabolic rate for most of you guys would be under 1,000 calories a day, then we could just, sit you there and not give you any food and give you some water, and you'd probably hang in there for 1 or something, right? That would be cruel and unusual, but it's a thing. It's a great question. So it depends, right? If they had an equal amount of muscle mass. One of the things that happens is people that have a lot of fat, they weigh more, so they have to have more muscle to carry around their weight. By having more muscle, they need more energy. The muscles is where the energy is. So if you could match lean mass and then just add adipose tissue without any additional lean mass, then I would probably bet on the person who has to have more adipose. Super lean person. Use that to make myself feel better.
Like 600-pound life like this.
No, I'm just saying that 43-year-old Dr. Black could survive in famine longer than 25-year-old Dr. Black. And that's what I'm going to go with. The survival instinct in those particular ways. So that's a good question. Okay. Let's talk about energy stores and some of our energy pathways that we're going to get into. Okay. I'm going to break these down in this particular way. Some of these pathways are going to be named a little bit differently, depending upon what book you read or what class you take. Okay? There's an older naming convention. There's a newer naming convention. There are some pieces of this that I'm very picky about. And I know that the things that I am very picky about, especially for folks that came to our undergraduate program, are a little bit different than the things that Dr. Mike is picky about. We were just different in how we were taught. Okay? You guys know all the pathways, you know all the things. We're just going to call things a little bit different. Okay? There's not one right or wrong way, except I think I'm right. We're all that way. Okay. So we're going to talk about energy and ATP that is available. We're going to call it immediate. We're going to call it an immediate store. That may be a slight misnomer, okay? But it is very, very quickly available, all right? These are sometimes referred to as the phosphagen energy pathways. Okay? That is whatever ATP you have floating around in your muscles right now, okay? Readily available, meaning we can access it immediately, okay? You have also in your muscles something called creatine phosphate, which which is a molecule of creatine with a phosphate stuck on there. And creatine phosphate, we can use this molecule in a one-step, very fast reaction to cleave the phosphate off and hook it on to ADP to get ATP back. Okay? So while it is not immediate, it is still a very fast way to get some energy. Then there is a reaction that is called the myokinase reaction, where I would take two ADP molecules and we break it down into a molecule of adenosine monophosphate and a molecule of ATP. And that doesn't happen super often, but it is an amount that we need to pay attention to. Okay? So I should probably start with all of this by just simply saying that part of this is a thing we have to pay attention to is the life cycle of an ATP molecule. Okay, I've got ATP. Now, if you care about the biochemical structure of ATP, right, like there's adenosine, there's sugar, there's a ribose or something in there, right? You get all those things, but the big thing is you've got something, you've got a scaffolding, and then hanging off of that are going to be these phosphate molecules. Okay? There should be three when it's ATP. Adenosine, tri, why I'm putting over a T in there. Adenosine triphosphate. Okay? When you go through the cross-bridge cycle, or you run the sodium-potassium pump, what normally happens is we cleave off one of these, and ATP gets converted into something called ADP, adenosine diphosphate, or 2. Okay? So now there's 2 phosphates. Most all of our energy pathways are going to involve taking this ADP molecule and converting it back in some way, shape, or form into ATP. I have ADP floating around. What I want to do then is grab a molecule of inorganic phosphate, hook it back on there, and so that I can get that. Okay? The more of these phosphates, these high energy phosphates, the more of them there are, the farther out you are, okay, the higher the energy state. About biochemistry, the organic chemistry of energy states and all of those things. Mostly because I'd rather have someone just hit me in the visit that, but it's a real thing. Okay? It's an important thing. Life doesn't exist without some of these things. So when I say we're going to go from ATP to ATP, this is what I mean. Okay? That's what I mean. So we have these immediate systems within like 1 step or 2 steps, we can get a resynthesis of ATP. It's important to note, okay, all of these things, stored ATP, creatine phosphate and the associated reaction with it, and myokinase reaction. All of these reactions take place in the cytoplasm of a muscle fiber, okay? In the cytoplasm of a muscle fiber. This is key because the ATP that gets broken down into ADP is in the cytoplasm. The other part of all of this that blows my mind, okay, blows my mind, is all of these reactions that we're going to talk about, they all take place because of differences in concentration rate. They're all random interactions. Okay? All random interactions. We ask Elise to stand up and close her eyes and walk around the room. If she's a molecule of ADP, she would get converted back to ATP if she bumped into the right thing here in the classroom. Okay? So when the classroom is bigger and there's more space and there's less stuff, it's less likely for a reaction to happen. When there's more things that are in there, it's more likely to happen. So it's way up here on the other side there. It's way up here on the other side. So okay. Our next set of reactions, and we'll go through each of these in quite a bit of detail. Our next set of reactions is what I'm going to call, or what some people call, non-oxidative reaction. remember, these three things are also non-oxidative. Non-oxidative just means we're not using oxygen. Okay? But that is also it's called non-oxidative. It's sometimes called anaerobic. It's sometimes called glycolytic. What this means is this is the process of glycolysis. Okay? And specifically, it's the process of taking a glucose molecule and breaking it down all the way, okay, all the way to lactic acid, which then dissociates into lactate hydrogen. Okay? And we'll walk through how we're going to get 2 molecules of lactate for every glucose. We'll walk through what happens with the carbons and what enzymes drive all of these things. Okay? So that way of thinking of glycolysis also occurs in the cytoplasm. Also occurs in the cytoplasm. Okay? The final bit is what people sometimes call oxidative or aerobic metabolic pathways. I typically call them aerobic. That's just the word that I always use when I was taught these whole things, but that's what I'm going to refer to as. This is where there is debate. So we can say oxidative metabolism is what happens when pyruvate from the end of glycolysis gets put into a mitochondria, and it goes through the Krebs cycle and then the electron transport chain. Right? Some people will say that the oxidative pathway is glucose through glycolysis to pyruvate and then that pyruvate into the Krebs cycle. It's whatever you feel like you want to think you can get away with. It's whatever you think is the thing that makes the most sense to you. I just want you to understand the steps. Okay. So there's a part of this, it's going to have to take something from the glycolytic pathway, put it into the mitochondria, and break it down if it's going to be carbohydrates. If it's fat, on the other hand, then there's a whole separate process, okay, where we do some things in the cytoplasm, and then we shuttle the fat into the mitochondria and break it from there, which we will go through in some level of detail. Okay? I have put these things on here. They are in sort of descending order of their speed. Why is glycolysis slower than simply breaking down stored ATP? What do you guys think? More steps. Very good. It's more steps. Glycolysis has, I don't know, 11 or 12 or 13 steps. I should try to find. Is it 12? Yeah, it's got 12 steps. Okay? It's one step to cleave a molecule of phosphate off of ATP. One step. Boom, done. Okay? So imagine you've got to close your eyes and walk around in this room, and you have to come into contact with things that will be a 12-step reaction before all of that happens. Okay? It will happen. It's just going to be slower than I just got to bump into one other. Okay? So it's slower. The creatine phosphate reaction is driven by one enzyme. It's a one-step reaction. Take off a phosphate, hook it on the plate. Okay? Biokinase, one step. Glycolysis has 12 steps. Okay? If we then go from the back end of glycolysis into the mitochondria, and we have to go through, right, there's 6 steps and 8 steps in the Krebs cycle. There's an intermediate step to get from glycolysis into the Krebs cycle. You have to take all your output from the Krebs cycle. You've got to go move all your electron transporters to the electron transport chain. And you have to ping down several cytochromes, and you've got to run the ATP synthase. There's a lot more steps, so it's going to be slower. Okay? It's going to be slower. The speed of these reactions is really important for how they're regulated. And that's one of the things we'll spend a lot of Wednesday and a lot of probably next Monday talking about. It's trying to understand when you exercise, when you do a particular task, why a certain proportion of your energy comes from each specific pathway, how that changes based upon the task that you do. A lot of it is about speed. A lot of it is about speed. Your potential to generate ATP is also listed in, right, in sort of descending order. You've got the smallest amount of potential energy to make, it's ATP in phosphagen reactions. There is a sort of double, but nonetheless limited amount you can make from glycolysis. And then theoretically, if I give you oxygen and I keep giving you substrate, then the ability of your mitochondria to make ATP is very, very large. I won't say that it's limitless, but it's very large. Okay. There's a lot of constraints that we place on that in real life, but in a vacuum or in a test tube, if I take mitochondria and I keep giving them oxygen, I keep giving them substrate, and they've got all the right enzymes and the transporters and things, like it'll just run a huge amount of energy. Okay. So there's going to be some give and take in all of this. There's some give and take in trying to trade off between speed and total ATP production. Are you guys with me? Then let us begin. So this is a fun graph. If anybody wants information on all of this, probably the best places to look are in an old, out-of-date textbook. It's not in print anymore, but I have a copy in my office. It's one of the main authors is George Brooks, who is sort of the father of lactate and things which we'll talk about later. But I have the book. I'd be happy to make you copies of the metabolism chapters if you care. This is a graph that I really like to come out of that particular book. What it is trying to show is on the x-axis, this is time during exercise. And then the y-axis is the percentage of energy potential from each energy system that is contributing, right, over 5 minutes of exercise. So imagine you're going to run for 5 minutes at as fast as you can go. Okay, whatever that speed is, you got to maintain that speed for 5 minutes. What you will note is, look at this immediate system, right? At the very, very first maybe 10 or 20 seconds, most of the energy that you're getting is all coming from these immediate phosphagen systems. That gets depleted, it falls very, very rapidly. We'll talk about why in just a minute. Then, as that begins to fall, you will note that we are beginning to turn up oxidative and non-oxidative, or what we'll think of as glycolytic pathways, to begin to contribute things. Okay, out here by about a minute, and again, this part of this is a misnomer. It probably shouldn't be. It probably shouldn't be. I guess the way that it's graphed is that at about, I don't know, maybe 30 seconds or 45 seconds in, you've reached the maximal capacity of glycolysis to supply energy. You will then note that over time, that's going to begin to fall. We'll talk about why that is from a regulation standpoint. And then you will also note that, hey, look, it takes several minutes for us to be able to get oxidative metabolism through the mitochondria up to speed. And so all of these things play really key roles in why can't you sprint for 10 seconds, but not, why are you going to slow down when you run 200 meters compared to 100? Right? Why can't you run the same pace for a 400-meter race that takes a little under a minute if you're pretty good at it than you could if you're running this? Why can you run faster there than if you're going to try to run a mile or something? So we can look at the capacity of each pathway to supply energy. Okay? This is as good a place as any to mention the one thing that if you learn nothing else during my lectures on metabolism, I want you to remember. At all times, at rest, during exercise, at all times, you are getting energy from all three energy or all of the energy pathways all the time. Unless you only exclusively eat one substrate, you're getting energy, even a little bit, from all energy substrates all the time. Okay? I don't know how it's taught in biochemistry. I'm not fully sure how Dr. Mike teaches it at other places that I have been, or sometimes in sophomore level physiology class in the biology department. We teach metabolism as these very discrete events. I start doing something. I use up my ATP and I use up my creatine phosphate. Then when that has happened, then I shift over and we're going to do glycolysis. And then when glycolysis begins to make a lot of lactic acid and it gets backed up, then we're going to shift and we're going to use the aerobic pathways, okay? Or we're going to use carbohydrate, and then as that begins to get depleted, then we'll begin to use fat, okay? And that's not actually how this goes. We're using all of them all the time. What we're going to spend an extraordinary amount of time and effort on is which pathway and which substrate is the predominant pathway, the one that's contributing the most energy, the substrate that is being used the most at a particular instant in time, okay? And that is the thing that is dependent upon intensity or total ATP demand. That is the thing that is dependent upon what your previous diet has been, what your energy stores are, whether you lifted weights beforehand, whether you took a pre-workout beforehand, okay? Those are going to be the things that get shifted, right? And that are going to depend in some ways on a person's state of training. Talk about a lot of that stuff, more so than kind of how does this function in everyday life, more so than do you know all the steps in the pathway. Okay? Are with me still? Not crazy yet? The crazy comes on Wednesday. So we start. To me, and that's just me, so it may be more difficult for me to teach it to you guys. The control and the integration of all the metabolic pathways simultaneously together is, to me, the most conceptually difficult thing that we will cover in all of class. Okay. That's the part that I think is the most difficult. Maybe because I can't see it. It's hard. Like I can't just hook you up to one machine and show you what's happening with all of these things at the same time, where I can put you on a dynamometer and I can show you what your force is doing, or I can put you on a bike and I can show you what your pace or your speed and your workout put in. Okay? You go back. Yes.
I think that this graph is really cool in terms of running. It's like nobody taught me how to run the mile race, but how you run the mile race is you start by going like very hard for the first 30 seconds. You stride out, you get going, and then like very much correlates to like how the graph
What's going on?
Yeah, you're like wasting your immediate energies, and then the other things are ramping up while you get through it.
Anybody ever had the experience of you're going to start exercising aerobically, so you're running, you're biking, and for about the first, I don't know, 4 or 5 minutes, you just feel pretty shitty? You're like, I'm going at a pace that is not that fast, but it feels worse, right, than it should. And you're like, oh, I'm up and I'm kind of all warmed up and now I'm in the groove. This is why. There is some zone in here where you've used a lot of your immediate energy. Your aerobic metabolic pathways have not sped up to their maximal rate yet, okay? And if you hit just the right pace, after a couple of minutes, what's happening is you're accumulating a lot of metabolic byproducts because glycolysis is the thing that's giving you most of your energy. You make lactic acid, it dissociates, the hydrogen ions make you feel like shit, it starts inhibiting things. You really do feel bad. And then you go a little bit longer and these things get spun up and then this falls back off and then you're fine, right? So there are a lot of things that really correspond to what is happening underneath all of this, okay? And so, you know, people that can win races, there's a kind of a tipping point that we'll talk about at the end of class in the midst of all of these things, where there's just enough pace where you've depleted all of this, but you can have some glycolysis going, but not quite too much. And then mostly your oxidative pathways going. And the person that can run the fastest or like at the highest power output at that particular kind of tipping point tends to be the one that wins. There's a lot of things that contribute. So,
right. So I've heard some coaches in the past.
they're all wrong.
They are. Yeah. Because they always just say that stating that it meets the story.
Yeah, by the time they get to the end, it's mostly gone. It's not all gone, but it's mostly gone. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so you can save some and then kick at the end. But the amount that you kick at the end is is a finite amount, and it's determined. We'll talk about some of the things at the end of class that determine it. We don't even understand all of it, but there's a finite amount that you probably have some amount of this still left at the very, very end. You never really get down to 0, on all of that. You just can make enough from these other ones that this is such a negligible amount. But yeah, so lots of talk on pacing strategy too. We don't really cover that in this particular class, but there's a huge amount of research on this sort of U-shaped pacing strategy that's probably the optimal kind of way to do things. You go out hard and then slow down and kick at the very, very end. We're trying to go at the same constant pace. It's not the best sort of way to so great.
So is there like an optimal warm-up period that like
yes, as it turns out, there is an optimal warm-up. Okay. Warming up is dumb, except for aerobic exercise if you're going to race. You don't need to stretch. Dumb. You stretch, it's not going to make you not get injured. You're not going to not pull your hamstring if you stretch. But this, if it takes 5 minutes or something at a reasonable pace to kind of get this up and going, then you probably during your warm-up, you need to get up and get it up and going. And then we'll see on what happens on the back end. And then you stop your warm-up and it begins to trickle down, but it comes down at a relatively predictable rate. But it never comes, it can take days to come all the way back down to kind of whatever its baseline was before you did anything. So yeah, this is absolutely something that we want to do. And so we don't, again, it's kind of more, y'all, if you take Dr. Deb's metabolism in the PC level class or some of the stuff they do in endocrinology, we'll see the stuff at the start of exercise. There's something called VO2 on kinetics. It's the speed at which you can ramp up aerobic metabolism at the front. It's affected by a bunch of things. One of them is there is, if we understand this, we understand the physiology, we can predict performance. We can get better at how we train and what we do, like during a particular race.
So you said the oxidative goes down and more quickly. What about the immediate pathway? How can that
Be replenished?
Yeah.
Great question. It is dependent upon, so the vast majority of the replenishment of the immediate pathways only occurs when you stop exercising. Okay? And the speed at which it can be replenished, weirdly enough, is determined by the speed of your oxidative pathways. You use aerobic metabolism to make the ATP to regenerate that immediate store by resynthesizing creatine phosphate, by replenishing your ATP stores, by pulling out of the metabolic compartments. So people that are in better aerobic training shape actually can replenish these things faster. So we'll just take, for example, Sarah, how much do y'all run?
not very much to do it's short bursts.
Okay. You guys do a lot of like quick, right? You know, I mean, sometimes rallies last, they can last 30 seconds or something, but they generally don't last that long. Okay. So, I mean, it's a move here, sprint here, slide, jump, block, right? One of those kinds of things. Very anaerobic-ish sport. And yet, I would argue that you guys need to be in good aerobic shape because it lets you replenish some of more of that, those immediate phosphagen systems while you're in between points. And you guys all go around between every point and high five each other and slap each other on the back, which I've never really, I give my wife, she's a volleyball player. I'm like, why do they do that? It's just one thing, like, you just messed up. I don't want to pat you on the back. That's how the guys think. I can't. Move your ass and get over there and do something.
Is that at all related to interval training?
Yes.
That's okay.
But one thing that it's really related to is mitochondria. If you have more mitochondria in your muscles, then this oxidative gets up faster. You replenish these other things once you've stopped faster, right? You can go anywhere. It's all about mitochondria. So that's really the whole thing. Mitochondria and fiber type. The two of those things working in concert are really the big thing. And you can use the interval training to increase the without having to run for like an hour. Great.
So when it comes to like creatine loading, is there any like
No.
benefits in like
No.
if you have prolonged exercise to do it long?
Okay, I say no. It's a great thought,
Right.
but you can't increase it that much.
Right. So
People that can increase creatine phosphate, if you are a responder, it's about 80% of people are responders, you can increase it maybe 15 or 20%. So it's a little bit. Having more creatine phosphate, which is hard for us to measure, may be useful for doing repeated sprinting activities. So it might actually be of some benefit for Sarandon playing volleyball. It's not really any benefit to a cross-country in those kind of ways. It might be a benefit to a football player or something. But you can't get that much more. And then most of us can have enough creatine to be useful for 15 or 20 seconds, maybe. So if you get a little bit more, is there a sport where you need to go 25 seconds? Or if if it's a 5-second football play, it doesn't really matter. I'm not limited by how much that is. And so I say that it doesn't matter, but there's a little bit of evidence that it may help a little bit in very, very select. I have 2 questions. What?
If somebody has like spasticity or something, how does this?
So it's an interesting. I don't know off the top of my head. What I'm going to say is wild speculation. It just, I think, makes plausible sense. If you are spastic, while you're being spastic, you have a muscle contraction that's going to cost you energy. A lot of that energy, the people that tend to be more spastic aren't very well trained, right? So a lot of that is going to come initially from their immediate kind of pathways. What we used to see in the spinal cord injured folks when I was a PhD student was some of them had a lot of spasticity, others don't. We don't really understand all of the hows and whys that we did at the time. But they'd be spastic, and we had to try to work around the spasticity when we were doing our Eastern training, because they'd be spastic and they would basically fatigue themselves from having those sort of spastic contractions. And then, because you put stuff and you touch them and they get spastic, and we have to try to wait and give them like 5 minutes, like it needs to stop. Then we got to wait 5 minutes to try to replenish creatine phosphate and these other sorts of things in an effort to get around that. Weirdly, we used to also think that spasticity was good. The ones that had spasticity had better muscle tone, if you want to call it muscle tone. They had visibly larger muscles. Their muscles, they actually did metabolism a little bit better. It was, if we could get the spasticity to not get kicked in, they could usually lift more weight and do more reps than the other people that weren't, because their muscles just worked better because they were actually being forced to contract through those spasms. So, I don't know if that really answered your question or not.
I was just wondering, like, would they go towards the oxidative?
It would all depend upon how long the spasticity would last. Right? If it was to last for a couple of minutes, sure. Yeah, probably. Yeah, anything that process energy is going to drive us in that direction. So, it's possible. Ready? Do you have another question? Yeah. Okay. I'll have 2 questions. Okay. We'll briefly talk about creatine phosphate, and then we'll turn everybody loose. Okay. So creatine phosphate, which we're often going to abbreviate just as CP, okay, in lots of the slide, that's what it's going to say. It is synthesized or pulled together from a creatine molecule and an ATP molecule. We grab a phosphate off of ATP, we hook it on the creatine, and you get creatine phosphate. Okay. The creatine comes from meat and fish and other things in your diet. Okay. You don't have to take the artificial or the creatine supplement. If you just eat like 3 cans of tuna fish a day, you'll get just as much of an increase in creatine as a person who's taking the supplement. About 98% of all creatine is located in the skeletal muscle. If you load with the artificial creatine, or you load, I say artificial, the creatine itself may not be artificial, but if you are supplementing creatine, you may be able to increase by as much as 15-20%. Okay? Seems like a lot, but it's not in actual practice that It's a very simple kind of one-step reaction. You have a creatine phosphate molecule. There's going to be an enzyme that drives this reaction called creatine kinase. When ADP levels inside of a muscle increase and the creatine phosphate gets driven by ADP, when creatine phosphate comes into contact with creatine kinase, it strips the phosphate off and it hooks it on here, and you make ATP, and then you're left with creatine. Okay? When ATP levels in the muscle are very high, like rest, then this reaction is reversible and is driven back in the direction. Right? Outside of breaking down stored ATP, this is the fastest method of us to provide it. It's very, very fast. It's immediate. Okay? It very often, outside of using stored ATP, is the first energy pathway. So a lot of times when I talk about breaking down ATP, that's not really a pathway. It's just you're breaking down stored ATP. So we'll say the creatine phosphate is the one that there's multiple. There's actually a step to it. It's very often the first energy pathway used, but the total amount of energy is relatively limited because the amount of creatine phosphate in your muscles is limited. Most people, okay, at very, very high intensity exercise, so think sprinting, okay, you have enough creatine phosphate to support that exercise bout with ATP for maybe 7 or 8 to maybe about 15 to 20 seconds. Okay? The single best way to illustrate all of this is to watch a person do a weight gain test that we talked about. You know, on the bike, you get a set amount of resistance. It's like 70% of your body weight. You're told to pedal as fast as you can for 30 seconds. And people are just crushing it, and they get about 12 seconds in, and their pedal rate just goes, it falls way off precipitously. You can just watch the creatine phosphate getting broken down. And as it goes, then they don't have enough ATP to break the cross bridges enough to supply enough force to keep turning the pedals at that particular rate. And then it falls way off, and then they kind of plateau off. Okay? This is why if you look at people that run 200 meters, which is a race, if you're a guy, the world record is like about 19 seconds. About 19 seconds. Okay? They're slightly slower. It's not just take your time in the 100 meters and double it. It's slightly slower because most of them don't have. They have enough creatine phosphate that they can run for just under 10 seconds to do the 100 meter sprint, but they don't for 200. Okay? They certainly don't if you're going to go any longer, something like that. Most of you probably have enough creatine phosphate to do a set of maybe 6 to 12 repetitions. Anything past that, depending upon how much the weight is, and it's going to push you beyond that kind of time period, you're going to use up phosphate. Okay? The half-life of resynthesis of creatine phosphate varies based upon how many mitochondria you have and your fiber type, but in general, it's about 90 seconds. Rough estimate, somewhere between 60 and 90 seconds. So when we tell you that you need to rest for 5 minutes between sets of weightlifting, there's a reason that we say 5 minutes. But if you say you need at least 2 minutes or you need at least 3 minutes, there's a reason. Because 5 is usually sufficient to get above 90%. That's where all of those things have come from. It's about recovery of all of these things. So it's about 4:15. We'll stop here. Okay, you guys had good questions. Brittany, do you have a question?
Yeah, I was going to ask if higher creatine levels is correlated to increased power. Or is it just like prolonged intermediate like?
I don't know if it's like top end power is much more so related to fiber type, absolute force level, but your ability to maintain that repeatedly is probably going to potentially be on creatine phosphate. That's